we are joined again by the wonderful, most beautiful Jane Baker. Thanks for coming again. What should people expect when they come and see you?
So, as with any physio, I'll take a full history. When did issues start? What they're experiencing. I want to know what previous injuries they've had that may have affected their feet. So we'll always look at history. There might be a family history of bunions. That's just interesting to note, because then you're actually saying, well, what are your kids' feet like? Maybe we need to start addressing those sooner rather than later.
Interesting. Yeah.
And then I will look at them walking. I'll do all kinds of different gaits with them. So I'm basically doing an overall screen to be able to pick up things to hone in on. So
it looks like the Ministry of Funny Walks.
It does look like Funny Walks.
And we'll get
full
recent
Monty
videos, some of those
Python.
later.
So for example, I'll look at them just walking. I'll look at them walking with their feet turned out. I'll look at them walking with their feet turned in. So I'm getting a global look at what their hip mobility is like, but I'm also looking at when they walk with their feet turned out, do they pronate on mid-stance? Is their foot flexible? Is one side the same as the other? I'll get them to walk with their feet turned in. I'll get them to walk as if the ceiling's very low. That's a really good way of determining whether they've got early heel lift. If they've got early heel lift, that is telling me that I need to check their calf flexibility or their ankle mobility or their big toe mobility. So I'll do a general screen. I'll also screen their back, because I'm also looking at leg length. I'm looking at pelvic mobility, sacroiliac joint, stalk test, all that stuff. I'll check hip mobility. I'll do Thomas test, so I want to know if they're tight in their hip flexors, because if they can't hip extend, that's going to have an impact on how the body's working or how the foot's moving. I will look at proximal tib fib joint, because I want to know whether there's tibial rotation. I'll look at distal tib fib joint. I'll look at cilius and gastroc flexibility. I'll look at big toe joint mobility, plantar fascia flexibility. I'll look at balance. I'll look at single leg eyes open, single leg eyes closed. If they're really good, I'll be looking at dynamic balance with head turning.
Yeah, that's hard.
I'll look at and then I always say to the patient, I am going to look at your foot at some point. But I actually need to get a really clear overall picture of what's going on in the body. Then I'll look at a more, depending on what they've come in with, obviously, and how much pain they're in, because some of them might not be able to move to be able to see, for me to see that. I'll look at foot muscle strength, so peroneals, tib post, tibialis anterior, flexor hallucis longus, flexor digitorum longus, extensors, so the extrinsic muscles of the feet. I will look at the intrinsic muscles of the feet. So a bit like we did, can you abduct your big toes? Can you do lumbrical or intrinsic function? And what's the mobility like in the foot? And then I will check joint mobility in the foot. So, for example, if a patient has limited ankle dorsiflexion, I'll check how the talus moves. Is there a restriction in the anterior posterior glide of the talus? I'll check all the midfoot joints, the navicular glide, does the cuboid move, the mid-tarsal joints, the metatarsals, and do the sesamoids move if there's a sesamoid issue. It depends. That's a global overview of everything that I could look at. Sometimes I'll check everything, and sometimes I won't. It depends. But that's pretty much, I typically see patients for an hour at least.
So, Jane, what happens to the foot in gait? What's normal?
So the foot has to be a flexible structure, and the foot has to be a rigid lever to be able to propel us forward through gait. So when the foot hits the ground, it's controlled by muscles eccentrically, lowering the foot to the ground. This is very simplified, by the way. And as it hits the ground, it becomes a flexible structure to get the big toe onto the ground, but also to absorb, to shock absorb. If you don't have that capacity for the foot to unlock and absorb shock, that can lead to two problems. So muscle problems and joint problems. Once the foot has pronated to land on the ground, as the body moves over the foot, it has to supinate, become a rigid lever to be able to propel you forwards.
So that's so for all of those who aren't physio, to pronation, supination. So we've got, as the foot comes through, the arch kind of flattens, if you like, and it sort of goes inwards, and then for it to go over the foot to then push off, it then turns outwards.
Exactly. So it's a subtle movement, but lots of people think, and particularly people who go into running shops to buy trainers, think that pronation is a bad thing.
Yeah.
Every foot has to pronate. It has to pronate to be able to get the big toe on the ground, to be able to re-supinate or go back and push forward. So we need pronation.
Yeah.
That's controlled by muscles in the foot, by the intrinsic and the extrinsic muscles. If particularly my favourite muscle, tibialis posterior, if those muscles are weak, so for example, if the foot pronates but doesn't re-supinate or can't, then we're going to have a strain on that inside part of the foot. So when I'm looking at somebody walking, it's great to video them actually, because then you can slow motion the video and you can see exactly what's going on. But you can see that movement of the foot from the heel through to the big toe and the push off.
So, just to be clear, land rigid.
Yeah, you land with a slightly inverted heel.
Yep. We soften as we pronate.
Yep.
To absorb shock.
Exactly.
And then as we go into the push-off phase, we re-supinate.
Yep.
To lock up the foot.
Exactly.
To become a rigid lever
to propel you forward.
Off.
So when I looked at Reese last week, he has done a little bit of work on his foot, which is great. When I looked at Reese, when he was in standing, he had quite a significant, almost bananaing of, you might need to turn into, yeah. So his heel was very much in this position. So he was very tight through the medial side of his foot, and he was loaded through the outside. And what he wasn't doing in gait was being able to roll through the foot to get the big toe on the ground. And what was happening was his tibialis anterior was overworking, particularly when he was running, and he actually came in with a tibialis anterior pain. So when I assessed his foot, what I looked at was whether or not he could actually, you see, you're much better than you were, whether he could roll from supination into pronation, and he couldn't. So what we discovered is he'd had a injury of his deltoid ligament on the medial ankle here 6 years ago.
6 years ago.
6 years ago that he probably hadn't fully rehabbed. And so when I assessed the movement of his calcaneus, if you sit down, when I looked at his left foot, I could evert and invert his calcaneus. So there was flexibility through the medial column. And when I looked at his right foot, still really stiff. And so we did lots of release, or Reese was supposed to do lots of release through this medial ankle to get that mobility. And then in standing, he actually worked into rolling into that pronated position. And I have a funky walk that I get patients to do to try and get that mobility. And then we also looked at his midfoot, and I assessed the mobility through the midfoot and discovered that his midfoot was very stiff. So if I look at this one, so if I go to the end of the first ray, find the medial cuneiform and drop it, I can get that rotation.
It's quite a big difference.
Yeah. And then I come back to this one.
So,
I'm having to work a lot harder to get that correct movement. So with the 28 bones in the foot, but 30 if you include the sesamoids, which are under the big toe, each one of those bones should move. So when I assess the foot, I'm looking to see whether there's mobility between, even the cuneiforms, is there mobility between those bones? And if there isn't, you can mobilise it to correct the function of the foot.
So for therapists out there that don't look at feet all day, every day,
Yeah.
what are sort of the key points that you're wanting, or the people should be looking for?
So, ankle mobility.
Yep.
So that is ankle joint mobility as well as soft tissue flexibility, soleus and gastroc.
Okay.
So we all know the knee to wall test. So that's a good indication of if there's an asymmetry or if there's significant stiffness.
Yeah.
Now, is significant stiffness a problem? I've got patients who are probably 3 centimetre knee to wall consistently, but they're pain-free, they have no issues running, it's not a problem. But you also might get someone whose their normal is 14 and they've come out of an ankle sprain and the other ankle's 3, that's a problem. So you want to look at symmetry obviously as well. So ankle mobility, calf strength, can they single heel raise? If there's a tibialis posterior problem, one of the key tests is can they single heel raise? If it's a tib post issue, there will be no calcaneal inversion. So basically, as they calf raise, the calcaneus doesn't turn in.
Right.
Which is the function
At the top
of
end.
tib
At
post.
the top.
Yeah.
Okay.
And if it's a tib post, if it's a tib post issue, they can't even get off the ground.
Yep. Through pain or just through motor?
So either pain or complete dysfunction.
Yep.
Balance. So single leg balance. Eyes closed. So again, I always say to patients, when you go out for a run, when you test someone single leg, eyes open, they're using visual feedback to maintain that balance. You're in a structured environment, you're in a safe environment in clinic. So it's the easiest place to test single leg balance. When you're out running, you're trying not to get run over, not to run into people, avoid that person with their head down on their phone.
A couple of distractions.
So you are relying on feedback from joints, muscles, ligaments.
Yeah.
So can you balance in a chaotic environment? Can you balance with your eyes shut? And then coming down into the foot, does the big toe move? And do they have toe function? So can they actually move their toes? I'm not a huge fan of picking up marbles and picking up tissues because it's a extrinsic muscle function as opposed to intrinsic.
Okay.
But it's a good place to start. Can you curl your toes and move your toes? Can you wiggle your toes? And those are probably the basics.
Yep.
I would say.
Okay.
And obviously screen the rest of the body.
Excellent. Midfoot stiffness. How would you go about assessing it?
So a couple of different things to look at. You can look at plantar fascia flexibility because that will influence midfoot stiffness,
Yep.
or you can actually palpate and mobilize the midfoot. So it's a very gross, simple way of doing it is to twist the foot
Yep.
and see whether the foot moves. But that is quite a gross way of moving the foot.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're actually getting into the individual joints and mobilising the individual joints. Because it's very easy when you mobilise a midfoot just to wiggle the metatarsals around.
Yeah.
And you think that you're mobilising it and you're actually not.
So how do people get in touch with you?
Jane at janebakerphysio.com.
That's an easy one.
That's
That is an
Easy
easy
one.
one to remember.